Morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. You are in for a very good informational discussion this morning from Dr. Taylor. We are very excited to have him here. I want to remind all of you that the primaries have begun, and so Election Day is May 19th. If you have not voted, please go vote. And also, please keep in mind that the Supreme Court is up for the final election this May. Jen Jordan and Miracle Rankin are on the ballot, and we can take those two seats on the Supreme Court. So please go vote. Take a friend with you. Make a day of it. Just get as many Democrats to vote for them as possible. I would like to introduce Betsy. She is our vice chair, one of our vice chairs. This will be her last coffee and conversations with us as a lead. We are so sad to see her go. She'll be moving soon, but can we give her a round of applause for all that she has done over the past few years? We love you, and we are going to miss you, Betsy.
Yeah, I'm going to miss you all too, but I'll be in the land of Tallarico soon, so I'll be working on James Tallarico's campaign, so it'll be okay. We're going to Austin, so at least we'll be in a blue city. So thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure of mine to be here and serve Cherokee County Democrats for the last 10 years, so thank you all. All right, so we have, if you're not aware, later on today there's a fundraiser. It's over at Reeves House in downtown Woodstock. Tickets are $40. I do have a few tickets that were donated, so if you're interested, you can come see me. I have 3 donated tickets that I can, if you're interested in going, let me know. Give me your name, and I'll have your name there. I'm the check-in person anyway for that, so you'll get to see me twice in one day. So if you're interested, you have a question, sir? Oh, yeah, good food. So the fundraiser focus is going to be celebrating Latino culture. So the food is Latino-inspired food. We will have a salsa band there. So I expect if you get there, I want to see you up and dancing. We'll also have a silent auction. We do the silent auction at all our fundraisers. They did an amazing job this year of procuring items. There's everything from artwork by local Cherokee Democrats, I would assume, because that's who we helped ask for donations from. And remember, any money that we raise stays right here in Cherokee County to go towards our Get Out the Vote efforts to continue to bring great programming like we have. You can. You can still make a donation. If you can't make it, you can go on our Facebook page or website, and you can either buy a ticket or make a donation. Yeah, we'll take your money any way we can get it. All right, so we do have a great speaker. He's going to come up in a few minutes, but before we get to Professor Taylor, we do have a candidate here who's running for state court judge. He is from Cherokee County. It's a nonpartisan election, but we get this question all the time. So this is Christopher Bishop. Please give him a round of applause. Please feel free to ask him questions, and he's going to speak right now.
Yes, thank you. So as she said, my name's Christopher Bishop. I'm running for state court judge. A little bit about me for the people that don't know. I'm born and raised here in Cherokee County, 6th generation Cherokee County. I've never moved or lived outside of the county except for the 4 years I lived in Athens. Go Dogs. Although as much as I'd like to move back, this is my home. This is my hometown. My parents grew up here. My dad was from the Clayton community area ball ground. My mom was from the city of Canton. I went to University of Georgia, got a finance degree, believe it or not, and then went into law school, which is kind of a weird road. But graduated from law school, passed the bar the first time. I always get that question. And then came back to work for my dad. For those that don't know, my father's Barry Bishop. He has practiced downtown Canton, has been practicing downtown Canton for over 50 years as a practicing attorney. I've been doing it now 21 years. This is my 21st year. I've done it both from the defense side and from the prosecution side. If those people have been here for a long time, remember Holly Springs used to have a night court. And so if anybody that got a little small traffic ticket or a stop sign ticket or a speeding ticket and may have seen me from about 2005 to 2008, 2009, we did it from 6 to 9:30 p.m., and those were some long nights. If you were last, you probably got a pretty good deal and a warning. And for For those that were early and thought they were getting a good deal, they got like a $75 ticket and got out of there. But no, seriously, the reason that I decided to run and decided to kind of move from what I've been doing as a defense attorney, because I feel like I help a lot of people, and I help a lot of good people. But I think I can help more from the bench. And the reason for that is there's a huge bottleneck going on right now in state court. For those that don't know or haven't been there, and please don't go. You don't want to be there. But as I've said to everybody, state court and city court, but state court in general, is about good people that have made a mistake. That is generally going to be your stop sign tickets, your speeding tickets, but they do deal with some higher level, multi-DUI offenses, some low-level misdemeanor family violence offenses. It's going to be your misdemeanor vehicular homicide, and then civil cases. Accidents. You got into an accident. You're hurt. You want to go after your insurance company because they're not paying you. It got into a big thing with COVID. Insurance companies weren't paying. Why weren't they paying? Well, it's really simple. We don't have any court system, right? Why would I pay you if you can't make me go to trial? There's a bottleneck. And a lot of things got pushed to the side. I think our court system has done a fair job at trying to push forward and trying to make sure that all citizens get served. The problem is right now, again, on that bottleneck is we have a Judge, Alan Jordan, who is retiring. I love Judge Jordan. I think he's done a great job. He's done it for 26 years. The problem is that he's still doing it old school. He came on the bench in the year 2000, and there are a lot of things that have changed since then. Everybody, I think, in this room probably has a smartphone. Everybody's probably used FaceTime or Zoom at this point. We are not using that in the court system. Our Supreme Court has given us the ability to use that, and we're not using it, at least in this courtroom, and not really using it effectively in other courtrooms. I'm not a politician. This is nonpartisan. Thank you for saying that. But politicians like to tell stories, so I'm going to give you one. If we had Zoom, the client that I had that lived in Arizona that had gotten a DUI here in Cherokee County, and he was wrong. He was guilty. We wanted to try to take acceptance responsibility for that and take his punishment for that. But he was getting cancer treatments in Arizona. We did not have a Zoom opportunity or any paperwork that we could file. He had to take a bus from Arizona all the way back to Cherokee County to resolve his case in court. Yes, it's insane. Now, down the hall in another courtroom, they do use Zoom opportunities for violations of probation. Now, think about that for 2 seconds. The individuals that are locked up under armed guard behind bars in our county jail can waive their physical presence. But my client who was suffering from cancer in another state all the way on the other side of the country could not. It makes zero sense. Unfortunately, when you run into or walk into the courtroom or into the courthouse, a lot of logic goes out the window. But I think I can change that. There's a lot of different things that are going on. As everybody knows, if you give, and this is from both sides, if you give government more money, they're going to keep asking for more money. You've got to make sure that they're using it appropriately. We have a brand new building that we reconstructed. It used to be the old R.T. Jones Library, for those who are familiar with downtown Canton. That was over a $6 million renovation and building. We now have over 20 employees working in that building for misdemeanor probation alone. And that's because everybody's on probation. And I don't know why. Georgia has the highest per capita percentage of people on probation than any other state in the United States. Yes. I don't know why. Everybody, I think, has learned that positive reinforcement goes a lot further than negative reinforcement. Those are the individuals. It's really easy to point out the people that are bad and need to be in custody. It's really easy to point out the really good people that don't need to be in custody. When you're getting in that middle, that's what kind of probation's about, right? But we need to set behavioral incentives. We need to do positive reinforcement. We need to take those individuals and those employees that we're wasting time and energy and effort and money on, that are watching traffic tickets, to watch multiple DUI offenders and to watch domestic violence offenders. We could early terminate probation for those individuals that are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Again, good people that made a mistake. They've corrected their mistake. Now let's focus on the people that can't correct their mistakes. Just one more easy example before I stop. Again, thank you. I don't want to take up all the time. I know I'm not the keynote speaker. And if I get on a soapbox, I'll talk all day. But one more thing. I think everybody's gone through school, right? You either went through high school, you went through elementary school, you got kids that went through school, you got grandkids that go through school. Our last calendar call for trial week on a Monday to start trials took 2.5 hours just to call roll. Imagine sitting in school, or your kid going to school, or your grandchild going to school, and sitting there for 2.5 hours and not doing anything. It's insane. And it's the old school way of doing it. People cannot do that. We need individuals, again, good individuals in state court. These are good people. We need them out in the community, at their jobs, doing what they need to do, and working, and when it's their turn to come to court to handle their case, then bring them to court and handle their case. And there's ways to get around it. There's things that we can do that don't cost the county any more money. You can do Zoom calendar calls. The judge is already getting paid. The prosecutor's already getting paid. The defense attorney generally is already getting paid, if you can collect. But you can do a priority calendar call via Zoom on a Friday afternoon and know the first 50 cases of that calendar, and you know what's going to go to trial. And you can come in Monday morning, you can resolve some of the stuff, right? If there's something that happens here and there, something that comes up, an officer has to be, on duty or out, witness is gone, we'll deal with those things Monday morning. But bring a jury in, and let's get it going. Because without the progress to get to the efficiency, you can't get to accountability. And if you can't get to accountability, then you're not holding criminals responsible, but you're also not holding the prosecution responsible or the insurance company responsible. If you're not getting to these cases and you're not trying cases and you continue to have the bottleneck that we have, people will hide behind it and nothing gets done. Again, my name is Christopher Bishop. Please go out and vote. Please go out and vote for everybody that you find appropriate. Either side, pick a side. It doesn't matter to me because I'm on both. Go all the way to the end. Please stay awake to the end. There's a lot of decisions and a lot of selections that you have to get to, but I'm on the very last page. But again, if you have any questions, please come up to me and ask. I'm going to hang around. And then if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, I did bring some pamphlets, some information. You can go to the website, find out more about me, or ask any specific questions that you have. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Remember, early voting is started, and Saturday voting is going on today and next Saturday, and you can go right down the street here if you finish today and want to go vote. If y'all know Ronielle Newman, she's there today as a poll watcher, so y'all can say hi to her. Anyway, so we do have our main speaker today. He is an associate professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. He's going to talk to us a little bit about state of affairs going on in this country right now. So please welcome Professor Ben Taylor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Sorry, I got to button my jacket. My mama would be upset. All right. So my name is Ben Taylor, and I'm an associate professor of political science at KSU. I've been at KSU since 2018. I actually grew up in LaGrange, and so I went to GSU all the way through undergrad, PhD, and grew up a Georgia fan, for the record. But nonetheless, I'm really excited to be here today. As I've told several people already, but I do some community events. I've talked to Aldi groups, and there's a group PALS in Dunwoody that I've spoken to, and I've been at a few different colleges. So we actually came back to KSU, got home a few years ago, so that was nice to be able to come back home. And so one of the things I've always I said is that community groups are generally better than my students, because my students don't know anything. And so my community groups, it's not their fault, I guess, but nonetheless. But my community groups are often much more knowledgeable. But this is probably the most knowledgeable group. So I puzzled really over what to talk about today, because I didn't want to tell you something you already knew. So, but when I was talking with Joella about, what to present and what you might want to hear about today, we talked about the Constitution. And as I was thinking about that, It's always interesting to me to talk about the Constitution, the structure of the Constitution, the separation of powers, checks and balances, and things like that. But I also wanted to bring in some political theory about how we got there and what does it mean today. Like what does this 18th century document and structure, how does it inform what we see? Mainly what we see and how we behave. So my focus in my research and my teaching area is actually political behavior. But we can't really think about political behavior unless we understand the structure of the government itself. And also, as another side note, I am from LaGrange, I am from the South, but I talk quickly. And that sometimes lets me sort of jumble my words. So if I am going too fast and not making sense, which is a very real possibility, please stop me and say, hey, that didn't make sense. You need to slow down. And I say, okay, you're right. All right, let's get to it. So our roadmap for today is we're going to talk about a few things. One, we're going to talk about the three branches of government. What is the structure? We hear a lot about it. We sort of understand it implicitly. You watch Jeopardy, you'll see some questions about it. But we should review. What does that actually look like? Then we're going to talk about the design in theory. And I'm going to focus a lot on the Federalist Papers. Has anybody read the Federalist Papers? Anybody? We got one. We got two, a little bit. The Federalist Papers are, I will not call them good reading. They are not good reading. But they are extremely important. And honestly, they can tell us a lot about, we talk a lot about the intent of the framers, as if, they were, tablets coming down from Mount Sinai with the burning bush. But the fact is that the Federalist Papers they're the only thing actually that can give us actual insight into what the framers were considering when they arranged the government the way they did. But then that comes to the design and practice. So we can talk about the Federalist Papers, and that's fine. But what does that look like when the rubber meets the road? And so when we talk about that, I'm going to show you some graphs and some sort of topical items and sort of look and think about, well, what does this look like today and how has it evolved over time? And we can think a lot about this in terms of like rules, so those Constitution and laws, norms, which is sort of the way we interpret the rules and how we sort of infer what they mean, and then our behavior, which is sort of the incentivized process of taking the norms and putting them into action, right? So we'll talk about all that stuff. And then some concluding thoughts. And I will go ahead and tell you, I have no great insights to share. I have only empirical observations and a few questions. So I hope that you have something, that you could tell me what any of this means, because I don't know. Anyway, here we go. So this is actually from my American government textbook. This is very small. I'm going to look at it closer. I apologize. I tried to make the graphics so that you could see them. If you can, I apologize. But basically, as you see, we've got these are the three branches: legislative, executive, judicial. And then the three branches sort of connect to each other, what we call checks and balances and separation of powers, right? And so in general, if you want to look at the legislative branch, which my pointer doesn't work on the screen, but the legislative branch has what we'll call the enumerated powers, right? So Congress, in Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress is given 17 specific enumerated or expressed powers that they and only they are allowed to do. Things like borrow, spend, tax, coin money, declare war, etc., right? There are 17 individual things. Those are the express powers. These are the things that Congress is specifically tasked with doing. But in doing those 17 expressed powers, they also have the capacity to check the other branches of government, right? So Congress has legislative checks over the executive branch through committee hearings and oversight. Of course, the Senate has advise and consent capacity over presidential appointments and things of that nature. And they can, of course, impeach officials if they so choose, right? Which the impeachment process, lest we forget, is a two-stage process. There's the impeachment process, which is effectively an indictment. And then there's the trial in the Senate, which is the actual removal from office or whatever penalty. And of course, we've had several of these trials for presidents and a lot for federal court judges as well, because that also works as a check on the judicial branch. And so the judicial branch is checked by Congress in a variety of ways. The approval of judges, again, advise and consent from the Senate. The constitutional amendment process, the creation of courts themselves, right? And so perhaps one of the ways we could deal with judicial bottlenecks at the state or federal level is create more courts, right? That's one thing they could do. The legislature, in our case, or at the state level. But of course, Congress can do that at the federal level, right? And so this is a check on judicial power, right? And so this is in Article 1. All of this is in Article 1 of the Constitution. And that is, by the way, Article 1 is Congress, specifically because the framers of the Constitution, and we'll talk about this in a second when we get to the Federalist Papers, they thought and wanted the Article 1 legislative branch to be the most powerful branch. But Congress, bless their hearts, they are, of course, humans, like all of us. We're so, we have our frailties. And they are, like anybody, incentivized for one thing, and that is re-election. People say this as a critique. I actually don't find it a critique. I think it's legitimate. Members of Congress should absolutely, correctly be worried about their re-election all the time. Otherwise, what is the check on their power? Like, we are the check on their power. And that's the way it's supposed to be. So I actually don't find it to be critical to say that all this member does is care about re-election. My response to that is, yeah, they should, right? So, but the fact is that because they're so focused on re-election, like all of us in our lives, they are going to do the things that make that as likely as possible, even if that means giving up these responsibilities, right? And so that's a really crucial thing to remember, because humans are incentivized. We always respond to the incentives laid before us. That is not something necessarily that the framers of the Federalist Papers considered entirely. They did a little bit, and we'll get to that. So then it comes to the executive branch. Excuse me, the executive branch. Now, the executive branch, of course, is Article 2, and the executive branch has some important responsibilities, right? The executive branch, and Hamilton was very clear about this in his Federalist paper writings. The executive branch should be active, and this is coming out of the Articles of Confederation. So under the Articles of Confederation, we had a plural executive, and actually the executive branch was actually put in place by the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. It was fundamentally unworkable and terrible, which is why we don't have the Articles of Confederation. And so Hamilton was specifically concerned about having an active and engaged executive, and they thought that it would be a single person, that's number one, just a single executive, and that person would be tasked with implementing the laws put in place by Congress. So the executive branch makes treaties, enforces laws and orders, and obviously the president is also the commander-in-chief of the military, because again, if you are in situations where you have military force or you have some sort of foreign policy engagement, you don't have time to be doing things by committee, which is by very definition what Congress is. So they needed something to act more swiftly than that, and so you have the president as the commander-in-chief. But the thing to remember, though, about the executive branch is that when the framers created the sort of legislative and executive sort of arrangement, the enforcement of federal laws assumed, or the process of enforcing federal laws assumed that Congress would tell the executive what they wanted done, right? How they wanted it done. And on some level, many moons ago perhaps, when times were more simple and the federal government wasn't as robust, laws made by Congress gave the executive branch a bit more direction, and also just sort of the nature of our politics of those eras. The executives did not feel it was their role to be as active as our sort of modern presidents are. And so that's an evolution of our norms as well. But nonetheless, the point is that the framers just made the assumption that Congress would be more directive in what they wanted policies to be. If you looked at how laws, now granted, our laws are much longer today, but that's because they're basically just taking the laws they've already written and sort of adding subsections and changing a few words here and there, right? They're just very long. So, but Congress, the directions to the executive branch are ever more vague, right? Because they give, and some of this is statutory delegation to the executive branch because Congress doesn't feel that they have the day-to-day knowledge of how to do these things. And some of it is just an electoral incentive that the more vague Congress is when passing a law, the less likely it is that an opponent could come along and say, you voted for this thing that did blah, blah, blah specifically, because then the member of Congress say, no, I voted because I thought it was the president who's doing this incorrectly, right? The president's interpreting it wrong, something like that. So, but the fact is that we have legislative checks and balances. We also have judicial checks and balances, and so getting to the judicial branch here. Article 3 is the judicial branch, and the courts, as Hamilton said, are the least powerful branch. And because they have neither the purse nor the sword, but they are crucially important, particularly for the upholding of the other two branches and keeping tabs on fidelity to the Constitution on some level. And but the judicial branch, of course, is where you can bring your court cases and what have you, but the checks on them are they can declare laws unconstitutional. They have checks on the executive branch by the interpretation of laws and reviewing of executive orders and administrative regulations and things of that nature. So the courts, while if you read Article 3, It's very short, actually. There's basically only one court established, the Supreme Court, and on that court is a Chief Justice, and the rest is up to who? Congress. It's them. Every court is a figment of our, we're living in Willy Wonka's world, right? I mean, this is all of this is just figments of our imagination. Like, how can we design it and imagine it? And we just go along with it because we are tacitly, in some cases, consenting to be governed by this structure, right? And so that goes back to sort of liberal theory, right? So that you can either tacitly consent or you can objectively consent. And consent of the governed is crucial sort of for this era. And as long as we abide by the structure of this government and continue to participate in its effectiveness or its sort of operation, then we are, on some level, liberal democratic theorists would tell us, we are at least tacitly consenting to this document. So this is the basic structure of the United States government, but I want to really dig into what all of this means. And if at any point you have any questions or anything, or if something I'm saying is not clear, or Lord knows if it's wrong, please let me know, right? Please let me know. So the design in theory comes down to a couple of things. One, the Federalist Papers are really important because they were trying to make an argument about why the new Constitution should be ratified. So you have the Articles of Confederation, utterly unworkable and terrible. And finally, particularly when big cities began to be concerned about having their rural neighbors rebel against them, Massachusetts specifically, they said, look, we got to do something different. We need a new constitution. We need a stronger national government. And so the Federalist Papers were written as, if you may not know this, but they were written as editorials, effectively, to try to persuade the most recalcitrant, sort of anti-Federalist leaning states, particularly New York State. New York was really divided 50-50, Federalists, anti-Federalists, and Hamilton, of course, being from New York, but New York was a massive port, you know, capital of the country and all these other things. And so they wanted New York to get on board with the new Constitution, to ratify it, to put it into place. And so the Federalist Papers were written for that purpose. But they're also quite foundational to explaining what American political theory is, which, again, it's interesting that the Supreme Court, Scalia, I think, actually, and some other sort of more conservative justices began the trend of citing the Federalist Papers in their opinions for the Supreme Court. But now it's very common. Elena Kagan, I think, does it more than Scalia ever did. And so it's very common among even liberal justices to cite the Federalist Papers because, again, they're foundational American political theory. And so if you want to get any real insight into what the framers actually thought, then you should read their words. Right? So, but the fact is that they started by thinking about, well, why do we need the Constitution at all? And I thought about this quote because, one, it is one of the most famous quotes from the Federalist Papers, Federalist 10. James Madison wrote that causes of faction cannot be removed, and relief is only to be sought by controlling its effects. The framers of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers were particularly concerned about the growing, what they called factions in America. We might think of them as political parties today, or we might think of them as interest groups, or really what a faction is any like-minded group of people who join together to try to achieve some political goal. And Madison's point in talking about the fact is you can't get rid of factions because they are implicit to liberty. If you are going to have individual and political liberty, you must be able to join with other people to exercise your political rights and see there's power in numbers, right? And so Madison said, look, you can't get rid of them. You're not going to get rid of factions, and to create factions is just a human activity, right? And so how do we deal with that? We have to control the effects of factions, according to Madison and Federalist 10. And this brings us to Federalist 51, where they were making the case for why we needed to structure the government the way we have, which is a three-part sort of triumvirate structure of legislative, executive, judicial. And by doing that, you create a situation where you have human beings. The other thing about the Federalists that's really important, if you read a lot of your ancient Roman philosophy or your ancient Greek philosophy, a lot of Western political philosophy generally, Machiavelli even. Machiavelli gets a bad name because of all that power. Well, kind of. But Machiavelli was actually, when writing to the prince, if you read the prince, Machiavelli was telling the prince to be a virtuous prince. There was a level of virtue necessary in public life. And so Machiavelli said, you need to always remember, it's better to be, loved than feared and all that kind of stuff, but really you need to keep virtue top of mind. Like what is the good for the public? What is the good for your people? That kind of thing. The framers There's a little of that, but not a lot, actually. The framers thought, nah, people are people. People are going to do what's good for them, and that's that, right? And so if you are going to recognize the reality, again, the frailty of human behavior, that we're going to do the things that we're going to do that are best for us, then you can't, in a democratic republic specifically, you have to structure that system in a way that allows ambition of one branch or one politician to counteract the ambition of another. Like, that's really crucial. And so this is why separation of powers and checks and balances becomes very important. An assumption that the framers made that is in some ways relatively implicit, but more explicit at times, and we'll see some of that, is that people who take office in the United States government under the Constitution, whether it's in the legislative branch, the executive, or the judicial branch, they are going to act in a way that prioritizes their institutional prerogative. Like, we've given the judicial branch these rights and liberties, we've given the legislative, the executive. If you're in the executive branch, then you are going to do the things that we should expect presidents to try to access more power, because that's what they can do. We should then also expect that the legislative branch will push back on that and say, no, 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 this is our responsibility. And we should also then expect the courts to step in and say, well, actually, that kind of thing. That's what we would expect. That's what the framers envisioned. And we can see that in a variety of ways, for instance, with Congress. In Federalist 51, Madison goes on to talk about a variety of things, but he says, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. So Madison was very clearly in Federalist 51 talking about the arrangement. Again, some of this is the stuff that we sort of talk about in my American government class, or we talk about it sort of on the news, or people sort of play. But these are the actual words of the framers. This wasn't just an assumption. They were like, well, which one should be first? The legislative? This was on purpose. The legislative branch should necessarily predominate. But moreover, we also think about the structure. It's not within the Congress, there's a particular design to having the bicameralism, right? So it is to make sure that the passions of the moment from the House, which is the representative by the only body of our Constitution that has always been directly elected, that the passions of the moment should be able to be halted by the Senate. So, for instance, this is important now because we often talk about getting rid of the filibuster. Should we get, Democrats were very upset during the Biden administration with Joe Manchin for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that people said was, you get rid of the filibuster. And Joe Manchin pushed back and said, well, I don't know, because we're going to be in the minority one day. And now, you see, Republicans are all hot and bothered some Republicans are very hot and bothered to get rid of the filibuster. And like other Democrats under the Biden administration, some Republicans are saying, whoa. John Thune specifically is like, well, I don't know, man. We're going to be in the minority one day, and then we're going to want this filibuster back. But the filibuster is a rule. It's not even in the Constitution. That's a whole other story. But the bottom line is that it's Rule 22, actually. I talk about that a lot in my Congress class. But the fact is that even that filibuster norm sort of fulfills the goal of the Federalist Papers, of the idea of the bicameral legislature. But again, this is all sort of how we got there in theory. And then, of course, the House should definitely be more representative. Right now, there's a lot of stuff going on with gerrymandering, and of course the Section 2 decision this last week, Calais. And the bottom line of all of that is that so the House of Representatives has 435 members, which we stopped in 1929, I think. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they literally just ran out of room. And the second was that they can't, if you've been to the House chamber, it is sort of out of space. And they were like, well, we're done. We're good now. We got an odd number. All the seats are in here. We're good. But they could add seats. And had they added, I did the math on this last night. If they kept adding seats at the same number of persons per district as 1789, it would be like 9,000 seats in Congress. Something crazy. Yeah, something crazy. But in any event, you could even just do something a little more reasonable than 9,000. Just have, 1,000. I don't know, nice round number. But the fact is that the Federalists talk about the design of the House and how it's supposed to be close to the people and should be frequent elections for accountability. And then the other capacity here is that, the Federalists talk about the use of Congress's oversight capacity. That Congress is supposed to create a check on the other branches to make sure that everything is running effectively. And that you can write down that the president can't do this or the courts can't do that. But unless you have a branch that is active in the pursuit of those limits, then it doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do you any good. So you have to have a branch that's actually going to fulfill its obligations. Well, then what about the executive, right? What about the executive? Well, the executive branch is really Hamilton's bailiwick. And so Hamilton really loved the executive branch, and which was, of course, a big critique of his contemporaries, of him specifically. But he said that energy in the executive is a leading character and the definition of good government. We needed an executive branch. Again, this is compared to the Articles of Confederation. You wanted an executive branch, a president who could actually do something, who would actually put the laws that Congress passed into place to execute the laws and what have you. This was all about ensuring energy and decision and accountability. But the president is not a monarch. Hamilton was very clear to point out. The president has term limits, or I should say a limited term, that is, say 4 years. There were no term limits, of course. And you could also impeach, although I think we have now seen, if I may say, impeachment is largely toothless. But that's because impeachment is exactly the kind of political event. And I always think it's funny, people say, oh, this impeachment is political. Exactly. Of course it's political. You can't, like, it's the political branches. Like, that's what it is. So anyway, that's just a personal bugaboo. But the impeachment process was supposed to be where Congress officially exerted its power over any other federal official, but mainly executive branch. But the problem becomes when the incentive structure for Congress is such that protecting one's party is more important than one's own constituency, then it becomes useless and meaningless, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. But the other thing Hamilton talks about is that you need to have re-elections for the executive branch. You can't just have someone out there forever because you need that accountability mechanism. And then finally, having a veto is important for Hamilton. Again, so all these things, we know that that's in these branches of government, but it comes directly out of, the reasoning for them comes directly out of the Federalist Papers. So just wanted to point out that this kind of stuff is in there. And then finally, to the judicial branch, Hamilton says that the judiciary has no influence on neither the sword nor the purse. It's the least dangerous branch, according to Hamilton. But the judiciary should be able to... Now, judicial review, which we all know and love, comes to us from Marbury versus Madison, a Supreme Court case in 1803. But John Jay was the Chief Justice of the court at the time, and John Jay was one of the, though you don't know it because he hasn't written any of these that we've talked about, he was sort of a laggard. But Jay was, he was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, so minimally we can assume that he sort of read these and knew them very, very well. And so Jay uses Hamilton's arguments in the Federalist Papers to make the case for judicial review in Marbury versus Madison that the court can do this. So judicial review is actually something that the court gave itself, effectively. It's not in Article 3. If you read Article 3 and look for the words judicial review, well, they ain't there. So it's something that the court assumed for itself, and we go along with it. We have gone along with it for these many years, right? And so, but Hamilton makes the case for it in Federalist 78, actually. And then also, we want to make sure we have an independent judiciary. This is why these folks, people were very concerned, like, why would we have this cast of unelected folks for a lifetime term? And they talk about the importance of independence from the political branches and the whims of politics and what have you. Again, you can sort of make your own assumptions about the capacity of the courts to be independent of those political whims, but there was the idea in theory. And then finally, the courts do have constraints. They're constrained by jurisdiction, precedent, because of the English common law tradition and things of that nature. So precedent becomes very important, stare decisis, which is to let the decision stand, rest on precedent. And then, of course, judges also can be impeached, right? So this is sort of the theoretical background of the interplay of checks and balances. And again, if this is something that interests you, I strongly recommend that you spend some time with the Federalist Papers. Excellent bedtime reading if you want to go to sleep real fast. Yes?
I have a question. It's theoretical, but it's also based on the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States just essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act.
Yes.
And that changes a whole lot of things. Some states are now taking that as a reason to stop an election process.
Yeah, the Louisiana thing is weird. I don't know how that's going to happen.
But the question is, of these three branches of government, where's the solution? Where's the fix for when the Supreme Court makes a wrong decision?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer. But I can give you, can I get to a little farther along and maybe we'll come to some. I might have some, again, I have no answers. I only have empirical observations and questions myself. But I do have some more to say about sort of how we got here. So the issue is that we really need to talk about design and practice. So we could talk about design in theory all day long, right? I mean, if any of you know folks who are like in theoretical, I have a brother-in-law who's an engineer, and he's like, oh, we could do this, we could do that. I'm like, okay, yeah, but how you going to build it? Like you could talk about it in theory all day, but we got to put the sticks together to make this thing stand up. So talking about something in theory is fine. What does it look like in practice? When we think about that as a political scientist, it's a scary place I'm going to take you, which is inside of my mind. As a political scientist, we think about things in terms of rules, norms, and behavior, at least I do. So rules, constitution, laws, that kind of thing. Norms are also important, right? So norms are the constitutionally informed but non-constitutional structure of our government. Right? So, they are changing. So that's the thing, right? So like the norms are constantly changing. And this is something that's very, very important. The idea that the president could effectively sue himself, right? So for all these things, like like what's going on, the Trump administration trying to settle with himself under, although that's sort of in a state of limbo at the district level. I saw last week they made a decision. The district court judge said that basically, well, if you're suing yourself, there's not enough difference in the parties, and so actually that's not allowable. But anyway, the point is that like that's a change in norms, but like norms evolve all the time. It was once a norm in the United States to own other human beings. It no longer is. So norms change, right? Some changing in norms are very good. Some are not good. So norms in and of themselves have no value. They have no normative value. They are neither good nor bad. They just are. And it's up to us as citizens to make our own decisions about this is something I think is good to keep. This is something I think we could get rid of. But the point is that norms, just as a class of things, how I interpret them is they're constitutionally informed on some level, but they are not the non-constitutional structure of the government, right? So again, the idea, like a lot of the stuff that happens at the executive branch is really norm-informed, right? And even within Congress, right, the filibuster and the rules of the legislative branch, those are based on a lot of norms, and that's fine. They're constitutionally informed, but they're not part of the Constitution. But they are important for how we experience government and the actions government can take, because then it comes to us as behaviors. So behaviors are the actions of political actors, both officials and citizens, within the system. But the really quick point I want to make here, and we're going to talk about this a lot, is that political polarization is something that we are living through. And it's different for us because I'm going to go out on a limb and say everybody in this room was born into an era of American politics where polarization was, if it was present, it was a very low level of polarization. The Cold War consensus was the predominant sort of ideological, and you can see that in poll data and survey data. If you look at the correlation between ideology, and Americans generally as a class are not ideological people. We're partisan. We're not very ideological, at least historically at various times. But if you look at like polling data from the 50s, 60s, 70s, look at the correlation between ideology and partisanship, it's not very strong. Like liberals or Democrats, conservatives or Republicans in general, but there are a lot of conservative Democrats and there are a lot of liberal Republicans in various parts of the country. It was much more regional and much more parental socialization based, your partisanship and your ideology. That is no longer the case. We are living in an era of expanded and increasing political polarization where ideology and partisanship are increasingly correlated. They're synonymous with each other, right? Democrats are almost entirely liberal. I thought it was funny. I sent an email to Joella and I said, hey, does this, just want to get some idea about what kind of the group is, blah, blah, blah. She said, well, we're Democrats and that means we're generally liberal. And I was like, yep. That's not a thing you might not have said 20 years ago. Maybe, like they were more liberal than the average bear, I guess, but not particularly like as liberal as they are today, right? So, and that's just a reality. That is just not a judgment, right? Conservatives, Republicans are much more conservative as a group than they were 20 years ago. Just a fact, just an empirical reality. But the fact here to remember is that we have to remember, well, what are the incentives? What incentives do our elected officials have? What incentives do we have as citizens in our behavior? Because incentives are what link our rules and our norms to our behaviors. So the incentives that we see before us, and we'll talk about a few of those. And I want to sort of give you a list of incentives then versus now. And I'm sorry if you can't see this. I apologize. I thought black would be better, but one of the baseline assumptions that we have in political science, this comes from political scientists David Mayhew and Richard Fenno and some others who study Congress, is that elected officials are, above all else, their proximate goal is reelection. They are single-minded seekers of reelection. Whatever else they want power, they want prestige, they want to be able to say, I'm Senator so-and-so, they want to be able to get into the right clubs and drive the right car and have lackeys to do their bidding, whatever. None of it matters if you can't get reelected. So reelection is their proximate goal, which is why I say again, people say, oh, that member of Congress just wants to get reelected. Yeah, of course they do. Good. Then they should behave like it, right? And so, but then we have to think about, well, who are their constituencies? That's the other thing. So Tip O'Neill was famous for saying that all politics is local. And when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House, getting along with Ronald Reagan, slapping backs after the 86 immigration reform or whatever it was, and Tip O'Neill was no fan of Jimmy Carter, when all politics was local, in Tip O'Neill's era, it was definitely the case. And what you saw was that members of Congress, whether Senate or House, and presidents and legislative offices, and all up and down the political food chain, were very, very focused on what their local communities wanted and what made their name in the local area, what got them support in the local area. So all politics was local because political survival was tied to local constituencies, what Fenno calls home style. So all members of Congress had a home style. When they're in the district, they're going to behave one way, they're going to wear flannel shirts. If you've read Bill Clinton's book, My Life, he talks a lot about being an intern for William Fulbright. And when Fulbright would go home to Arkansas, he was always wearing jeans and flannel shirts, and he's driving his truck around, right? But when he'd go to Washington, D.C., he wore these really fancy suits, and he had a driver, and he went to the finest restaurants, things that people back in Arkansas would just find ridiculous and absurd and probably may be mad about. But he could act differently because, again, it was the middle of the 20th century. The media environment was different. People didn't have as much access to information. But so Fulbright was using his home style because his reelection, William Fulbright's reelection, was tied specifically to how people in Arkansas felt about him. So he was good for Arkansas. Let's not mistake it. Just as Richard Russell was good for Georgia, even though he was a virulent racist, right? Things like that. So the fact is that your home style mattered a lot to get reelected, right, all the time. And so home style is really important in the all politics is local era. There are weak presidential coattails. We can measure this in political and presidential split ticket voting. We're going to look at that in a second. And members defend institutional prerogatives, and informal norms reinforce constraints and compromise, right? So there's a great story if you've read the Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson biographies, which are really fantastic. Then you've probably remember the story of Lyndon Johnson going to the House as a member of the House from Texas and getting on the House Armed Services Committee where the chair was one Carl Vinson of Georgia, Millersville actually. And so Carl Vinson was very clear that, now, do you know where Millersville is? It's not near the ocean, right? And so but Carl Vinson was very clear. That was his Navy. The United States Navy was his Navy, and he was going to take care of it. But he also brought a lot of stuff home to Georgia, right? So in Dublin, there's a massive VA hospital down there, right, and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of federal VA installations and things because of Carl Vinson. It was a home-style thing, right? And so Vinson fought with Democratic presidents and Republican presidents to make sure that he got what he wanted, right? That was an era when all politics was local. We don't live in this era anymore. This ain't us. We are over here. Political survival for our politicians today, and it has been increasingly the case, but we are really, I don't know if we're at the zenith because we don't know the future, but we are at certainly a high point to the extent that our members of Congress, senators, members of the House, even state officials to some extent, that's the only way to explain what is happening in the Republican primaries in Georgia right now is that all politics is national because Georgia is a very competitive state, right, 50-50. And this electorate in 2026 is going to be relatively more Democratic, probably, at least motivated by an anti-Trump sort of sentiment. So if I was a Republican politician in the year of our Lord 2026, I would not necessarily be cuddling up to the president, except for the fact you have to win a Republican primary. You can't. You can't win it otherwise. So that is the rock and the hard place. And the same thing was true in 2022 for Democrats like Sherrod Brown running in Ohio. You wanted to be a good soldier for President Biden in 2022 if you're Sherrod Brown, but you still got to get reelected, right? And so it's just a very, very tough needle to thread when all politics is national. So nationalized politics has divorced the incentive structure from taking care of your home district or your home state and how you represent in Congress. And so now we have extremely strong presidential coattails. Members are going to prioritize partisan goals over their local constituencies or their branch interests. This is the really important part, or their branch interests. The framers of the Constitution, the writers of the Federalist Papers, did not anticipate an electorate, a voting public like ours. They could not have anticipated the way that our nationalized politics have affected our voting behavior, because that now overrides the sense of institutional responsibility that members have. And you can see that in a variety of ways. When you have a Democratic president, Democratic Congresses don't hold as many oversight hearings. But when a Republican is in office and you have a Democratic House or Senate, oversight hearings all day, every day. And the same is true for Republicans, right? So this is a pox on both their houses thing, right? So, but the fact is the reason that happens is because of the nature of our politics. But that also means that our norms begin to weaken as a zero-sum partisan competition takes hold, right? And this is the trouble. So we can see this in a variety of ways. So this is from the New York Times. This is, you can't see the date, but I'll tell you, this is from 2016, February. Antonin Scalia has just shuffled off this mortal coil, and the the Senate Judiciary Committee writes a letter to Majority Leader Mitch McConnell that says, "We are not going to hold hearings for Merrick Garland or any other nominee because the American people need to have their say in the next election," which is months away, right? This is a breaking of norms, right? Now, the Constitution simply says that the Senate shall have advise and consent over all nominations, including judicial nominations. It doesn't give a timeline. The norm had been, when there was a vacancy, you begin the process, right? This is a new norm. Now, you can, if you're a Republican, you think, yeah, of course, this makes a lot of sense. And if you're a Democrat, like everybody in this room, you say, oh, this is terrible. Fair enough. It's not good or bad, depending on your perspective, but it is a changing and it's shuffling, ripping of norms, if you will. This is an example. This only happens in an environment where nationalized politics is what sets your incentives, as opposed to your state incentives or your home-style constituencies, right? There's another example. This is from the New York Times yesterday, actually. So yesterday, the New York Times had a graph of disaster aid approval by state vote. So red bars are states that vote for Republicans, blue bars are states that vote for Democrats. And you can see that the Trump administration, well, there's always a little difference here or there. Bill Clinton actually approved red states slightly higher than blue states. George H.W. Bush was the reverse, right? Blue. George W. Bush took a little longer, right? But mainly, like, the bars are basically the same, right? Presidents across parties are basically approving aid roughly at the same level of quickness. This is the number of days it takes to approve aid. The Trump administration is not, right? They are not. This is Trump 2.0, by the way. So there's a radical shift. This is a huge shift in norms, right? This is something that what does the Constitution say about this? Nothing. This is just how are the incentives set up, and what does that mean for the behavior of the actors inside the system, right? Because again, one of the things that I like I sometimes do some Sunday talk show stuff on Atlanta News First, on their On the Record show, and they're nice folks, and we talk a lot about politics, off the show or whatever. And one of the things that started happening, this is even before the Calais decision this week, but when Texas kicked off gerrymandering, redistricting in the mid-cycle, and then California started going after it, and Virginia and all these other states, and you've got Ohio doing it now, Florida's going to do it, and all this kind of stuff. All of this is, that kind of stuff is normatively bad for our politics, because nobody's going to win in that. No, Democrats are going to be unhappy in red states, Republicans are going to be unhappy in blue states. It's only going to deepen antipathy, right? And so if you're looking at things from a good, bad, sort of normative value judgment, that kind of partisan one-upsmanship across this at the state level is normatively corrosive and bad for our politics. But this is why that kind of stuff happens, right? Because the events like this. This is Congress. So this is another example of norms meeting behavior. So this is the number of roll call votes in Congress between 2001 to 2025. We are currently living through. Now, I don't envy Speaker Johnson. He has a very tough job leading, as people have often said about Congress, herding cats, right? So I don't envy any speaker, but Speaker Johnson is particularly bad at his job, not for any partisan reason, but just because the job of the speaker is to hold the majority in line and to only get votes to the floor when you know you're going to win, and he never seemed to be able to do it. So just from like an objective point of view, like what's a good speaker, what's a bad speaker, he's not a good one. But it also shows, like, to their credit, I guess, it's not like Congress has been real productive in a while. That's the other thing, right? So Congress is increasingly non-productive because there's no incentive for them to be productive. If their election chances are basically correlated with how their state votes in a presidential election, then they're just going to pass whatever funding bills they can to avoid shutdowns. Generally, that had been the case, although less so these days, although now the entire government is funded. As long as they do that, they're just let the executive do it. And that's not the design of the system. But the reason that it is working this way is because the framers could not have anticipated that incentive structure. And so they didn't put any guardrails in place to sort of help our elected officials 250 years later navigate this, very unlikely scenario in their mind, right? But this is a very, yes?
So is the Supreme Court in its rulings, is it trying to set those guardrails now because they're telling Congress with changing the laws as far as like the Voting Protection Act?
Well, that's a harder case. So there are several types of decisions that come before the court. What we've seen consistently is that, and I'm not a judicial politics scholar, so I'm not real conversant in this, but what I will say is that, in general, what we've seen from the Roberts Court is that it's distinctly conservative. That's not in question. But it also has a sort of pro-executive power position. And that changes with courts, right? That evolves over time. Some courts were less protective of executive power. Some courts are more, or congressional power, expand, contract. This court seems to, whenever they have been given the opportunity, and sometimes they've just sort of gone off without even really needing much help from their litigants, they have given the executive more power and responsibility and restrained Congress by telling Congress to be more specific in the lawmaking process. So one of the ways that they really limited the they use their major questions doctrine. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But one of the ways they've used that is to tell Congress to be more explicit when it gives direction to the executive branch, so that like this particularly happened with student loan debt forgiveness. They said that the Biden administration's process for forgiving student loans was not specifically written into the law they were using to do it, and they need to be more clear. Although in other times, this court has told the executive branch they could do things even if they weren't in the law. So it's largely ideological in some sense. But in general, in a theoretical point of view, the court is trying to, as Chief Justice Roberts has said, call balls and strikes. The problem is that they're politicians. They're politicians. And again, that's not a critique. I don't think calling Supreme Court justices politicians is a critique. How do you get a job on the Supreme Court? You've got to be eyeball deep in politics. They're not just rolling up to Georgetown Law School. Who's the best professor here? We want that legal scholar to be on the court. No. That's not how this works. That is so naive. And so I don't find it a critique to call Supreme Court justices politicians. They seem to want to ignore that fact because we are all masters of cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning. But the fact is that they are politicians, and they are making decisions from a political perspective. Sometimes those seem quite strange to us. Like Gorsuch particularly has a real affinity for Native American groups, and so he's always usually pro-Native Americans in his decisions, but that's an interesting quirk. But in general, as a body, the court is much more conservative, and they're making conservative decisions. It shouldn't surprise us, right? But if I could just I have a few more slides. This also shows you the number of bills passed by Congress. So these are non-election years, and these are election years. So there is something of a difference, but still, it's going down relatively. And one of the reasons you see all these bills in election years higher than non-election years, a lot of these are messaging bills. So like bills about, they're passed resolutions to say, we don't want, we want to destroy the woke mind virus or something. If you're a conservative Republican Congress, or if you're a Democratic Congress, you say, we want to protect women's rights to choose and things like that by resolution. So they're not laws, but they're passing these bills. And so the fact is that they're just going down over time. That's the main point here, is that Congress is not doing as much as it once did. Now, some congressional scholars will tell you that's because bills are longer. That may be true. But it's also true that they are just doing less. But I wanted to show you a little, this is a graph of ideology scores in Congress. So there are these folks named McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal who started measuring congressional ideology in the 1970s, and it is a really cool and robust data set. And you can go check it out if you have time on a Saturday night and you're just kind of hanging out with your iPad and you're like, I want to look at some political science data. You can go to voteview.com and check this out. But I wanted to highlight a couple things. This is the antebellum period. And so this is a measure of liberal conservative ideology. And you can see here that at this time, Democrats were much more conservative, relatively speaking, and Republicans have always been a little more conservative. But this is a measure of support for civil liberties ideologically and economic. There's two variables here: economic sort of engagement by the government, and then civil liberty protection. So how are members voting on those two dimensions, and they measure ideology this way. But once you get out of the sort of past the antebellum period, you see that Democrats are largely more liberal than conservatives on these dimensions, particularly economic dimensions. And it sort of stays that way. But you'll notice there is some ebb and flow. So this is the Gilded Age, but you'll notice that this is these lines. So this is the average, this is the mean of the ideology for the Republicans and Democrats respectively. And you can see, and this gray bar is of the Congress itself, and it goes back and forth between who has the majority at the time. But you can see basically that the Republicans and Democrats are pretty far apart in the Gilded Age, right? So our politics, that we live in a very polarized era, is not unique. There have been polarized eras before. None of us have lived through them, actually. So that's what makes this unique to us. And so then you can get, this is the Cold War consensus. So this is when we were all born, sort of socialized into politics. You can see ideological means come together. Again, the means are not like next to each other. So Democrats and Republicans have always been different, but they were not as far apart as we are today. But today you can see that it is much farther apart, and it is growing apart. And this is up to the most recent data of 2024 and 25. And so this is where our politicians are getting their incentives. They're getting their incentives from us on some level, but it's also the information environment, where the incentives on getting media attention and fundraising is really crucial, right? So who's giving the most money? The most ideological Democrats and Republicans are going to give money to politicians, right? And so that's where your incentive structure is. And you can see this based for the mass public based on voting. So this is from the American National Election Study. This is a measure of split ticket voting, presidential and congressional votes. So did you vote for a Democrat or Republican for president? And then did you vote for a Democrat or Republican for Congress? And so this is for the mass public overall. And I highlighted the year 1980, and I'll just, because you probably can't see it very well, I'll just tell you. In 1980, you had roughly, I will call it 25% of the voting public who, or 7 to 8% actually, who split ticket, right, one way or the other. 34.5% voted Democratic straight up. 37.8% voted Republican straight up, right? So you have a fair chunk of the American public who are split ticket voting, right? Let's fast forward to 2024. We have 3%, 1 point, so we're going to less than 5% of the voting public split their ticket in 2004. According to the American National Election Study, which is, I should point out, the most robust study of American political behavior that we have. That is why we know anything about American political behavior, is because the ANES. It has been going on since 1948, every 4 years. It used to be every 2 years, but, NSF. And so now it's every 4 years, and it is the gold standard of American political behavior survey data. And so we can trust this, is what I'm saying. Yes?
Could you repeat the name of that organization one more time, please?
The American National Election Study. Yeah, it's at electionstudies.org is the website. You could just go, they have this is from their data visualizer, so it's very useful. Or if you have a statistical software package, you can download it and play with it yourself. But this is broken up by party. So this is broken up by party. I just wanted to show this to you. 2024 only. So this is this last slide, but let's look at it by Republicans and Democrats. 94.9% of Democrats in 2024 voted a straight ticket. 90.5% of Republicans voted a straight ticket. And I'm self-identifying Republicans and Democrats, so not the general public. But partisans are voting straight tickets, and that's fine. And the difference now, though, is that the reason this is happening now is because our politics has become nationalized. So increasingly, we identify as our local politicians no longer need to develop a home style. As long as they can inform us if they're Republicans or Democrats, we're going to go along, right, generally. Which is, by the way, why party primaries are so much more competitive now than the party primaries have always been competitive, but they're much, much more, I think, vociferous in their attacks on each other than they once were, right? Ronald Reagan's committee, thou shalt not talk bad of other Republicans, or like the 11th commandment, right? And of course, and Bill Clinton in 92, if you watch those debates, he was getting flack from Jerry Brown, but you seem to agree with everybody up here. He's like, well, we're all Democrats, we've all got good ideas, right? And so the fact is that now you can't do that. You can't agree with your opponent, even in primaries, and that's because politicians understand the whole game is the primary, largely, right? Well, independents are here, so they're in the middle, and I could look at it. I should have gotten that slide. But you can see, many of them are voting a straight ticket as well, right? So, but this is this part of the graph here, these gray and brownish parts, that's the split ticket voters, and it's even quite small among independents now. So that's interesting. And independents, these are people, the reason someone calls himself an independent, just generally speaking, is because they don't pay attention to politics. Not because they don't have political attitudes or opinions. They just don't pay attention. They don't like politics for whatever reason. They don't like the bickering, the back and forth. So that's what makes them independent. But they typically have a side. If you really pushed them on it, like, well, really, are you a Republican or Democrat? They will usually call, oh, I'm a Republican, or I'm actually a Democrat. I vote mainly for Democrats. Right? So, and this I wanted to show you, and this isn't as good as I wish I'd done a different slide, but this is what we'll call negative partisanship. So these graphs are feeling thermometers of political parties so the feeling thermometer is somebody in a survey is asked, on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 meaning very cool, 100 meaning very warm, could you express your level of feeling toward some institution, Congress, political party, president, whatever. So this is feeling thermometers toward the Democratic Party by party. So these are Democrats on the far left, Republicans on the right, and independents in the middle. And the green is very cool, purple is cool, we'll call this magenta bar, is the neutral. So this is like basically, the blue bar is cool. It's neither warm nor cool, and this is warm, and then the orange bar is very warm. So if you're getting farther to the right, you're getting very warm. Farther to the left, you're getting very cool. So you can see here that Democrats have always liked the Democratic Party. Shocker. I'm going to tell you something you didn't know. So these are Democrats. They like the Democratic Party quite a lot. Not as much, actually, but still more than other folks, right? But what's notable here, and this is why I have this titled Negative Partisanship, what's changed between 1980, 96, 2024, is Republicans. So the independents are largely normally distributed, so they're basically sort of mainly at the 50 point. But Republicans used to be much more evenly distributed. Then they became a little cooler. But now look at this. Republicans here in 2024 are this green bar is very cool. Over 50% of Republicans are somewhere between 0 and 25 for their feeling thermometer towards Democrats. This is called negative partisanship. It's not just that I'm a Republican because I think the Republican Party is good, or I'm a Democrat because I think the Democrat Party, but I'm a Democrat because I don't like Republicans, right? That's negative partisanship. And that's also, well, empirically, that's unusual, even since 1980. But let's not leave the GOP out of here, right? So this is, again, this is basically a mirror of what we just saw. So here, Democrats are basically pretty evenly distributed. They have no feeling whatsoever toward the Republican Party in general. But as you move along, a little cooler, and look at here, 55% very cool. Just like Republicans towards Democrats, this is negative partisanship. And this is what incentivizes our politicians, right? This is what incentivizes our politicians. Just to show you really quickly, this is the 2020, this is 2012 to 24. This is the two partisan slides side by side. Democrats love Democrats, right? Oh, I'm sorry, Republicans, they don't like Republicans. Sorry, I flipped them over. And this is Republicans don't like Democrats. So that's, that's where we are. And so what have we learned today? Oh, Lord, what have we learned? So the main point I wanted to make is that the Federalist Papers understood and made clear that they thought, look, humans are self-interested. That's not unique or special. That's a fact. And we cannot depend on virtue alone, right? Humans, we hope for virtue, we expect virtue to some level, but you've got to structure incentives, right? And they also thought, and this is where we are having some problems, they thought that the actors in the system would jealously guard their roles, and that has changed as the incentives have changed, because now our nationalized politics makes this very, very, very unlikely. And just yesterday, again, I went to the news and I said, Google, show me this thing. No, I'm just kidding. But I was reading NPR, as you do, and I saw an article that said Republicans say they will defer to Trump on Iran war despite arrival of deadline. That is fundamentally exactly the opposite of what the framers of the Constitution would expect Congress to do. But if we're being intellectually honest, we should also similarly expect when a Democratic president does something that a Democratic Congress would hold them to account if within their Article I responsibilities. Right? That is the job. That is the job. But in our nationalized politics, that is much less incentivized. Much less incentivized, which is very important. So where does this leave us? I really have no idea. But what I will say, just as a closing thought, just as a closing question, is really it's if ambition for politicians no longer maps onto institutional responsibility, then what mechanism can we have to try to restore the balance? I don't have any answers to this. And I do think that the debates over gerrymandering are a bit overblown, because gerrymandering is literally as old as the Republic. But what's different, gerrymandering is qualitatively different today than it was in 1820 with Elbridge Gerry Salamander, because, or 1812, whatever it was, because we have GIS software, we know down to the address how people are voting, we have so much other data, and so it's very different. And so on some level, if you want to think about this in an economic terms, like how do you restructure incentives? The most important thing I think that we could do as a body politic would be to create more competition. Because it doesn't do anybody any good to have solidly blue and red congressional districts or state house districts or whatever. Because fundamentally then your choice is in a primary, and that's good if you happen to be from the partisan group that has the majority in that district. Good for you. But if you're in the minority group, like I would imagine a lot of Democrats are in Cherokee County, then it's going to be more, the capacity to which you can exercise your franchise is significantly limited. Because what you're voting as an exercise, but are you making a difference in some way? Not if you don't have competitive general elections, because you've given the parties no reason to compete over you. And that really is what we've lost. We've lost the level of competition. The only place we really have it, actually, I think, is probably at the presidential level. And that's unfortunate, because you're not actually voting for president, as we all know. So anyway, but that concludes my event. So I think, yes. Yes?
Are you inferring that maybe we need a third party now?
Well, so that's a great question. Third parties are very unlikely to be successful in electoral systems where you have single-member districts with first-past-the-post elections, which is what we have all the way up the food chain. And so the only way that you inject additional parties into a political system in general is by having some proportional representation. And so I don't think that's likely. But I have no problem with the two-party system myself. Like personally, this is Ben talking, not Dr. Taylor. I don't have any problem with the two-party system. And I don't think that it would, I think that you can have more competition in a two-party system if you change the way you draw districts. Right? Gerrymandering is really the issue because of the precise nature of finding the right voter on the right street to put in this district versus that district. And that's just a level of technology that no one in 1787 could have ever imagined. Who could have envisioned such a thing, right? So, and that's really, that's just something that we've got to deal with. There's absolutely zero incentive for any elected official currently in office to do it, because they're already elected. Why would they do something? They got the job. So, yes.
How would Hamilton, Madison, and Jay felt about Supreme Court Citizens United decision?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Oh, honestly, I'm not really sure, but I think that money in politics was a big deal at that time as well, right? And there were constant debates about limiting the power of money, and actually Hamilton was often accused of trying to bankroll people for office at the New York State House and things like that. So, I think that they would be as big a political fight with them as it is for us, right? But yeah, that decision, though, importantly, could very easily change with a different court, I think, right? Because that decision is effectively just that, Justice Kennedy's personal position on that, and if you've got a more liberal court, I think it goes away. Thank you. Yeah. But I hope that this was helpful to you. Interesting at a minimum. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did I run over time? Oh, okay.
Thank you for coming out and giving us that great lesson. One more thing, our next Coffee and Conversations will be back at RT Jones. We try to switch between the two. Next month, we're going to be doing, it's kind of more of a workshop kind of thing. We're going to have what we call open dialogue. So as we get into the election season, a lot more people are going to come in contact with people that we might not agree with. And this is kind of an exercise. The open dialogue is going to give you kind of the tools to have those conversations that might be uncomfortable, that might be with people you might not expect, and you might run across people that you don't expect that are wanting to talk to you about politics. We're also going to be doing becoming a volunteer. So as you're here with us, you become ambassadors for us. As you learn more about the party, we want you to go out there and talk more about what we're doing, about our candidates and things like that. So we're going to try to give you tools, again, to help you navigate the political system and the elections that we have going on. Because we need everybody. Everybody's going to be an ambassador for us. If you can't volunteer with our Get Out the Vote team, please, when you have these conversations, these tough conversations with people, we're going to hopefully give you the ability to feel comfortable having those conversations. So that's going to be our next Coffee and Conversations. And then in July 4th is actually the first Saturday of the month. If you don't know this already, we're going to be walking in the parade in downtown Woodstock. So if you want to walk in the parade, we're going to have a float, hopefully with a giant blue wave on it. We need more people to walk if you want to walk. But there won't be a Coffee and Conversations because it's always the first Saturday of the month. So June will be our last one until August. Okay? Thank you all very much. We have both Christopher Bishop here, if you want to talk to him about his election, and the professor, if you want to talk to him a little bit more about the Constitution. Thank you all, and please, we've got about 10 donuts left. Eat. Thank you.